Ready to get into some seriously thought-provoking stuff? We're diving deep into Nietzsche today, tackling excerpts from The Gay Science.
And it's not about what you might think at first glance with a title like that. The Gay Science is actually a translation of the German Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft.
Okay, so right off the bat, we're dealing with a bit of a translation quirk.
Exactly. And that phrase, Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, it points to a more joyful, less rigid approach to knowledge. Think about the art of, like, medieval troubadours.
We're setting aside any preconceived notions about the title then, and really trying to get into Nietzsche's headspace.
Yeah, and that's key with Nietzsche, because this guy, he wasn't afraid to challenge, well, pretty much everything.
Right, like take the idea of goodness even.
Hmm.
He wasn't content to just accept traditional morality.
No, not at all. He dug deeper, suggesting that some virtues, he used the example of constant industriousness, might actually be, well, harmful to individual fulfillment.
So he's making us question those things that honestly we often just consider automatically good. It's almost like he's pulling back the curtain on our motivations, making us ask ourselves, why am I really doing this?
Exactly. He even suggested, and this is a really thought-provoking one, that praising selflessness might actually be in the self-interest as the people doing the tracing.
Okay, so unpack that one for me.
What makes you think? Are our actions truly altruistic? Or are they driven by a desire for social approval? Maybe even a sense of superiority? This is a tough question to face.
It is. It's almost like he's saying, check your motivations at the door before you congratulate yourself too much. And speaking of challenging assumptions, we've got to talk about probably Nietzsche's most famous or infamous idea, the death of God.
Right, and it's important to clarify here. He wasn't talking about a literal God dying.
Gotcha.
It's more about the decline of traditional religious belief and the values that we, as a society had come to associate with that.
So it's about more than just a belief in God. It's about what that belief represents.
Exactly. And he illustrated this with that powerful anecdote, you've probably heard it, about a madman running through a marketplace announcing God's death.
Yeah, that's an image that tends to stick with you.
For sure. But what's really interesting there is that the madman doesn't just say, hey, everyone, God's gone. He claims that we're all responsible.
Oh, right. There's that element of culpability.
Yes. And that's where it gets really interesting. Because if God is dead, as Nietzsche argues, then what happens to, well, the very foundation of morality? What gives our lives meaning if those old structures are gone?
So it's not just about God's absence, but about this vacuum of meaning that's left behind. And this is where Nietzsche's idea of creating new values comes into play, right?
Absolutely. He wasn't content to simply tear down those old systems. He challenged us to create new ones, new names and valuations and appearances of truth, as he put it.
Okay, so break that down for me a bit. What does he mean by creating new names and valuations?
He was suggesting that this very act of creation, of naming, of assigning value, could actually shape reality itself. He even went so far as to suggest that we might need to become gods ourselves to navigate this new godless world.
Whoa. Become gods. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What does that even mean in a practical sense?
It's a powerful image, for sure. I think at its core, it's about recognizing the immense freedom and the immense burden that comes with living in a world where we are essentially our own authors. If there's no higher power dictating right and wrong, good and evil, then it falls on us to define those things. We become responsible for creating our own values, our own sense of purpose.
So it's not about nihilism, about saying nothing matters. If anything, it's about the opposite, taking radical responsibility for our lives and for the world that we create.
Precisely. And that's a daunting but also exhilarating prospect, I think. It's about recognizing that potential that we have within us.
It's like he's saying, look, the old stories are gone. Now it's up to us to write new ones. But writing those new stories, figuring out this whole meaning-making thing on our own, that's not always easy, is it?
Not at all. In fact, Nietzsche seems to suggest that we often get in our own way, especially when it comes to things like compassion even.
Really? Okay, how so?
Well, he had this really complex view of compassion. He argued that it could be, in a way, a subtle form of self-gratification.
Interesting.
Like, we feel good about ourselves for feeling bad for others, potentially avoiding more difficult actions, or self-reflection in the process.
So it's not that compassion is inherently a bad thing, but that it can be kind of a trap if we're not careful.
Exactly. He was urging us to be more conscious, more aware of what drives our actions, to make sure our compassion is genuine and not just a way of boosting our own egos.
Right. I've heard that idea summed up as the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And, I think that really gets to the heart of what Nietzsche was trying to do, to make us question those things that we so often just take for granted.
It's about constantly pushing ourselves to think more critically.
Right, those seemingly good impulses that might actually be holding us back.
Absolutely. He wanted us to be more self-aware, to really examine our motivations,
Mhm.
and to ultimately create lives that were more authentic and fulfilling. And sometimes that means challenging even our most cherished beliefs about ourselves and the world.
And speaking of challenging beliefs, Nietzsche had some pretty provocative things to say about art. He didn't see it as just entertainment, did he?
No, not at all. He believed art was essential for helping us see the world in new ways. He contrasted Greek tragedy, where passion is expressed beautifully, eloquently with opera, where the focus often shifts to a more immediate sensory experience, sometimes at the expense of language.
So it's not that one form is inherently better than the other, but more about recognizing how they engage us differently.
Yes, each art form, in a way, offers a unique lens through which we can view reality.
So for Nietzsche, art becomes a way to, I don't know, maybe break free from our usual ways of seeing and feeling.
Precisely. And he saw this as essential not just for our own personal growth, but for society as a whole.
And he wasn't just talking about, like, the beautiful and inspiring aspects of life, right? This was about confronting the difficult, even the downright ugly, too.
Absolutely. He certainly wasn't afraid to go there. And that's evident in some of his most controversial work, his writings on women.
Right. We'd be remiss not to mention that those writings are often considered to be, well, let's just say complicated.
They're complex, multifaceted.
Yeah.
He was grappling with, both those traditional views on gender roles, but also with a recognition of the power and influence that women hold. He famously said that women are the ultimate actresses.
Which is a pretty loaded statement. What do you make of that?
Well, it's definitely open to interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, in a way, he was suggesting that women have this innate ability to perform, to present different facets of themselves depending on the situation.
So not necessarily about deception, but about, like, navigating those complex social dynamics that women often have to.
Exactly. And he even goes on to suggest that this ability to kind of adapt and play different roles can be a source of strength. He talks about how, in his time, upper-class women were raised to be, well, completely ignorant about sexuality, essentially.
Yeah, like, keep it all hush-hush.
Exactly. Only to then be thrust into marriage with, little to no real preparation.
It's like they were set up to fail from the start.
And Nietzsche doesn't shy away from describing the psychological toll that this took on women, does he?
Not at all. He suggests that these societal pressures could lead women to develop a deep skepticism, a mistrust even, towards men and the whole institution of marriage. It makes you wonder how much those societal expectations have really changed, even today. But Nietzsche's exploration of human relationships, it didn't stop at just romantic ones. He also had some fascinating things to say about friendship.
Oh, absolutely. He held friendship in very high regard, even suggesting that it could be, in a way, more fulfilling than romantic love, which is a pretty bold statement.
So what did he see as the difference?
He saw friendship as this meeting of equals, a space for genuine connection, for intellectual stimulation, something that, really challenged you and helped you grow.
And that's something he felt was often missing in those more, I don't know, hierarchical relationships, right?
Exactly. Where one person is always leading and the other is always following. He felt like those imbalanced dynamics, they could really stifle personal growth, prevent us from truly expressing ourselves.
So it's about finding those connections that challenge us, inspire us, help us to become more fully who we are. And, when you put it that way, it seems like kind of a recurring theme for Nietzsche, this idea of pushing ourselves beyond our comfort zones in order to achieve a more, I don't know, a more authentic existence. But that kind of growth often comes with, well, a good dose of discomfort, doesn't it? He doesn't shy away from those harsher realities of life either.
No, not at all. He has this one passage where he describes life as cruel and inexorable against anything that is growing weak and old, which is, pretty intense.
It's a little jarring to hear, right? Like, is he saying that aging and decline are inherently bad things?
Well, I think it's important to remember here that Nietzsche was all about challenging those conventional ways of thinking, even our ideas about what's good and what's bad in the first place. He saw weakness in any form as something to be, I don't know, confronted and, if possible, overcome.
So it's about grappling with those raw, sometimes uncomfortable truths about, well, about our existence.
Exactly. And ultimately about finding meaning and purpose within those cycles of life and death, even when it's difficult.
And speaking of difficult, Nietzsche had some surprisingly relevant things to say about, well, about the constant noise and distractions of modern life.
Oh, absolutely. And this was long before our, always on hyper-connected world, which is pretty amazing. He seemed to recognize even then just how overwhelming all that stimulation could be.
He even suggested that it might be driving us to crave silence, solitude even.
Yes. He has this beautiful passage where he describes it using the metaphor of a ship gliding silently past a noisy shore.
There's a real sense of peacefulness in that image, like a retreat from all that chaos.
And he even goes so far as to talk about and this is a quote, magic of women as a kind of action at a distance.
Okay, now that one's interesting. What do you think he was getting at there?
It's a really fascinating idea. It's like he's saying that true power doesn't always have to announce itself loudly. It can be subtle, it can work indirectly, and that maybe it's even more potent when it's not constantly in our faces.
It makes you wonder if he'd say something similar about relationships in general. Like, sometimes a little bit of distance, a little bit of space can actually make the heart grow fonder.
It's an intriguing thought.
Yeah.
And considering how much he advocated for solitude and self-reflection, I think it's entirely possible. He really saw those quiet moments, those moments alone, as being absolutely crucial for, well, for creativity, for personal growth, for really connecting with ourselves on a deeper level.
He even talks about the importance of having a room that's, dark and quiet like a cave, almost for sleeping well.
It's true. It's like he's saying that we need those spaces, both physically and mentally, to truly recharge, to reconnect with ourselves.
It's a powerful image, especially in our overstimulated world. And it's something that I think a lot of us struggle with, finding that quiet, that stillness. It can feel almost impossible these days.
It's a constant battle, for sure. But that makes his insights all the more important, I think. That reminder that true strength, true wisdom, it often comes from within, from those moments of quiet reflection.
And that inner strength, I think, it often involves confronting those parts of ourselves that, well, that we'd rather not. And Nietzsche had some really insightful observations about how we tend to, I don't know, judge ourselves so much more harshly than we judge others.
Oh, absolutely. He called that tendency winter sickness.
Winter sickness.
Yes, a kind of a negativity that sets in when we spend too much time indoors, dwelling on our imperfections. He suggests that getting out into the world, engaging with other people, can help us to gain a healthier, more balanced perspective on ourselves.
It's like we need that interaction, even when it's challenging, to remind us that we're not alone in our struggles.
Exactly. And it's not just about how we compare ourselves to others either. Nietzsche also talks about the ways in which we try to hide those perceived flaws and weaknesses, even from ourselves.
Like we're trying to convince ourselves that we're not really seeing what we think we're seeing.
Exactly. He uses this really striking metaphor of clothing to describe how we create these external personas to mask our true selves.
It's like we're all putting on a show, presenting this carefully curated version of ourselves to the world.
Right. And he even suggests that some people become so adept at this masking that they essentially turn into coats themselves, constantly adapting their appearance to fit in.
That's a powerful image, and honestly, a little unsettling. It makes you think about all that pressure to craft this perfect image, especially in the age of social media.
It's definitely something I think Nietzsche would have a lot to say about. But he goes even deeper than that, pointing out that it's not just about those outward appearances. We can internalize these roles, these identities, to the point where we start to believe that they are who we truly are.
So it's not just a matter of taking off the mask. It's about recognizing that we've become so accustomed to wearing it that we've forgotten what's underneath.
He talks about how people, especially as they get older, can become so attached to their professions, their social roles, that they lose sight of other possibilities. They forget that they once had the freedom to choose a different path.
So it's about recognizing when we've become prisoners of those identities, those stories we tell ourselves about who we are. But it's not about erasing our past experiences, right? It's more about recognizing that they don't have to define us.
Precisely. Nietzsche was all about embracing change, recognizing that potential for, I don't know, reinvention that we all have within us.
Yeah, it's like we can choose to rewrite those stories at any point. We're not stuck with the narratives that we've, maybe been telling ourselves for years. And this idea of of conscious evolution, I think it ties into something else that really stuck out to me in Nietzsche's writing. It was his thoughts about like authors and readers, he had this idea that some writers, they almost intentionally make their work difficult to understand.
Oh, absolutely.
Like it's a way of filtering their audience almost.
Yeah, it's like they're creating this intellectual obstacle course.
Uh-huh.
And only those who are truly committed to the journey are going to make it to the end.
And he owned that himself, didn't he? He kind of admitted that he didn't want just anybody reading his work.
Oh, yeah. He was very upfront about that. He wanted readers who were willing to engage, really wrestle with his ideas, even if it took some effort to get there.
He wanted them to, I don't know, maybe even to challenge him a bit. He compared his writing to, and this was a great analogy, a cold bath.
Yeah.
Like you don't need to soak for hours on end to feel that invigorating effect.
Right.
It's about diving in, embracing that initial shock.
And then letting those ideas kind of wash over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he really did have this knack for presenting these complex ideas in a way that was, I think, accessible, but also really thought-provoking. But even though he questioned so much of, like conventional thinking, he didn't completely dismiss traditional forms of knowledge. Like he had this real respect for philology.
Oh, absolutely. The study of language, literature, the history of words, how they've evolved over time. He saw that as a way to, I don't know, to preserve, to transmit these valuable texts across generations, to make sure that those works would still be around for, for readers in the future.
It's like tending a garden in a way, carefully cultivating those ideas, making sure they have the space to, to flourish.
What a beautiful way to put it. And, Nietzsche himself, he was deeply engaged in that process of preserving and transmitting ideas. He was constantly drawing these connections between different thinkers, different philosophies, weaving together this really rich tapestry of insights about, about human nature, about art, about this whole search for meaning that we've been talking about.
And it wasn't just about looking back either, right? He also talked about the importance of incorporating the past into the present, like breathing new life into those old ideas by, I don't know, reinterpreting them through the lens of our own time.
Yes. He gives the example of how Roman poets would, and this is a quote, conquer Greek texts, but not through, literal warfare. They would conquer them by translating them, by adapting them for their own culture, making them relevant to their own time. It's about actively engaging with the past, not just blindly accepting it. And in that process, uncovering new meanings, new layers of understanding.
So it's about finding that balance, right, between honoring those traditions, that wisdom that's been passed down to us, but also recognizing that we have something to offer as well.
Yes, exactly. He truly believed that true knowledge is always evolving.
Yeah.
It's constantly being reevaluated, reinterpreted, seen through the lens of new experiences and new perspectives.
It's a much more dynamic view of knowledge than a lot of us are probably used to. And, I think that leads us perfectly to that final, really powerful image that Nietzsche leaves us with in The Gay Science. That metaphor of the ship that has, and I'm going to quote him here directly, left land and gone to sea, the bridge behind us demolished.
It's such a striking image.
It really is. It perfectly captures that feeling of venturing out into the unknown, that sense of, I don't know, of no return. And he's very clear that he's not just talking about like literal exploration, right? He's talking about our willingness to challenge our own beliefs, our own assumptions, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it feels a little bit scary.
He's urging us to be explorers, in a sense, explorers of our own minds, to embrace the uncertainty, the vastness of that open sea, even if it means leaving behind the familiar comforts of the shore.
To become what he called free spirits. Those individuals who are willing to question everything, even those most fundamental beliefs about themselves and the world around them, and to recognize that, there are no easy answers. There's no one right path to, to happiness, to fulfillment. It's something that we each have to figure out for ourselves.
But, there's also something incredibly exciting, I think, in that realization. This invitation to become artists of our own lives, to embrace the inherent complexity of what it means to be human.
To write our own stories, create our own values, and maybe, just maybe, to become gods of our own making. It's a lot to take in, that's for sure. But hopefully it's given you, our listeners, something to ponder, some new perspectives to consider.
Definitely.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Nietzsche's The Gay Science, we want to hear from you. What resonated with you? What new insights did you discover? And maybe most importantly, what uncharted territories are calling out to you, urging you to set sail and explore?